Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, we are going to be going over some of the best decks as well as some of the easiest decks to play in Duel Triangle, the new Fusion Synchro XZ deck building slash, I don't know, like extra deck mechanic war, I guess. It's kind of interesting. But I'm going to go over the best decks to play as well as the easiest decks to build slash play for the event. So basically what that means is what is going to be easy to pick up, easy to play, easy to just kind of like turn your brain off and play, as well as what is going to be some of the best decks, and we're going to go over one for each of those, for each of the different strategies. So we're going to start off here with Fusion because it is extremely simple. Let me just quickly change the group. It is extremely simple. Just play the Loner deck as the easy deck to play. Now, it may seem like it's a difficult deck to play. It's, you know, fairly difficult. It's pretty simple. You kind of just click buttons and you mostly do it. The biggest things to note is that first and foremost, the reason I'm choosing this one in particular is because you do not have to build a single deck. You just click this, you load in, and you're good to go. It is a competent deck that actually does a lot and can play through quite a lot as well. It plays hand traps and stuff like that. Like, you know, you have 3 Ash, you have the double impermanent, stuff like that. It's not perfectly built, but it does do its job, which is the important part. The important things to note: Sword Knight is a negate in the grave as well as on the field. You banish it from the field or grave to negate the effect of a monster, or when a monster effect is activated while you control Chimera, the Flying Mythical Beast, which is either this guy or this guy. You're never making this guy. It's this guy. Okay, and then Coatl is a negate in the graveyard as well, where if a card is targeted, when a card effect is activated that targets a card you control while you have Chimera, the Flying Mythical Beast. Yeah, once again, same guy, either this guy or this guy. Then you're able to negate an effect. Very, very useful. Chimera Fusion is not a once per turn. You can fusion someone as many times as you want. However, if this card is in your graveyard while you have the Chimera on your field, you can add this card back to your hand, or you can banish it to special summon both a Mythical King, or Gazelle, the King of Mythical Beast, and a Bergamot from your deck or grave. That's like the reason these are being played. They're not very good. You don't have to play them. You don't have to really think about them either. But honestly, you can play this deck just straight up, easy peasy, load in, just kind of click buttons and win. If you know what Guardian Chimera does, you're good. A lot of the cards just kind of recur themselves. You don't really have to think about it. You don't really have to read the cards. Boom, done and dusted. Now let's talk about the best deck for Fusion. Let me show you that deck real quick. Okay, so it's branded, pretty much. This is just a list I threw together utilizing the ban list. Now, notably, Aluber is at 1, Albaz is at 1, and Albion are at 1, which is like super minor changes. The deck is still super consistent. The deck still basically does the exact same thing that it does in regular ranks. The changes are inconsequential, and I know someone will say, no, they actually do matter, but realistically, the power level of the deck still does the same thing, and it still is consistent enough that it doesn't really matter. A lot of the hits just kind of don't change anything in terms of it, at least in terms of power level and consistency. Like, technically, in theory, they should, but in practice, they just don't. Here's some 50 card lists that I just kind of threw together real quick. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily like the best list. I would probably refine it a little bit more, but something like this. You could also play branded tier, which also works very, very well. The tier stuff is all available. Rhino Heart's at 1, but other than that, like, all of the other tier stuff is basically available, so you can play that paired together. You can play more of like a 40 card list with like just branded fusion stuff and like very centered on that, playing with tier. So, you know, some sort of branded tier is probably in some capacity your best bet. So there you go. Those are your 2 options. And obviously, if you're already a branded player, you'll have God Hands given to you, because that is how Yu-Gi-Oh! Works. At least in Master Duel, I swear, branded players just draw better. So yeah, obviously, this is going to be the best deck. There are other options with Fusion, like you could play like Runic stuff, because all of the Runic stuff is available, but there's nothing really like great to pair the Runic stuff with. Obviously, like, you could play the Runic stuff, but like there's not really anything particularly great, because normally Runic one of the big upsides for Runic is the fact that you can pair it with like synchros, or you can pair it with link monsters or something like that to kind of get monsters out of the extra monster zone, or to utilize that extra body or something like that. So there's that, but can't really do that. But with that being said, yeah, this is probably in some capacity the best deck. 50 cards, don't know. Maybe it's 40, maybe it's 60. Who knows? Grass is banned, so do keep that in mind. But also another big thing is like, so is Dimension Shifter, so is Maxi, so is a bunch of these other cards that could cause issues, right? And the overall power level is just a lot weaker because, like, there's no link monsters. So having decks that basically don't care, like specifically branded, doesn't care about the fact that there's no link monsters, there's no pendulums or anything like that. And so because of that, they basically get to play the game as if nothing changed, which is one of the reasons why they're really, really strong right now. Let's hop into the Synchro one. Okay, so for Synchro, it's kind of interesting because technically the best deck is also the the easiest deck, which we'll get into in a second. But I do want to bring up Virtual World. Virtual World is incredibly cheap. Don't look at the extra deck right now. Just look at the main deck, okay? All of these are staples. Maxi, or Ash Blossom, Nibiru, Triple Tack, Imperm, Called By. All of these are staples. You do not have to play these, but they make the deck better. Even Gamma and stuff like that. Everything else is SR or lower. Genuinely. So the entire deck can be played with SR or lower. Besides, you at least need one Shen Shen. So if you want to spend the 1 UR, like the 30 UR crafting points to grab one Shen Shen to play a new deck, honestly, Virtual World is super sick and super fun. All of the rest of these are either staples, like Baron or something like that, Omega, Stardust Dragon, or are not actually necessary. The second Shen Shen, not technically necessary. Gigi, not technically necessary, right? Trishula and stuff like that, not necessary. Let's hop into Sword Soul though, because that is the actual deck that I want to talk about. Alright, and this is my list for Sword Soul. It's probably not the best, but we'll explain it in a second. The biggest part of Sword Soul is that you can also play it with a whole bunch of other worm type strategies. You can even play it with Virtual World, which we talked about previously, which also has a bunch of worms. But Sword Soul is the easiest deck, as well as probably the best deck for Synchro. So Synchro is kind of weird in that capacity. Now, I brought up Virtual World because it's significantly cheaper, unless you've gotten the structure deck, and you actually happened to get the structure deck as a returning or a new player, which is great. If you did that, that's fantastic. You now have access to basically this for free, which is great. But yeah, this is a fairly competent deck, and is very, very strong. Can put out some really nice boards and really good interactions. I'm pairing it with the Yang Zings so that I can go for Danglong and to grab up the counter trap, which is pretty nice. Danglong also like allows you to play through Imperm and stuff like that on Moye a little bit more efficiently, which is also why we're playing the Adhara. And stuff like that. But all in all, it's a pretty simple deck as well. You know, you make Chi-Xiao, you make Baron pretty consistently. The deck still functions very similarly, even without the Tenyis. The biggest downside is that you can't play the Tenyis as efficiently. While I am playing Adhara, it's literally just a guy on the field as a level 1 tuner to get into things like Danglong. So there's that. But more or less, the deck plays the same. There's not really much to change. You could add in an extra Taya, you could add in a thing here or there, you could change up the worms that you're playing. I'm playing Yang Zings, as I mentioned previously. You could play the Virtual Worlds, you could play any other worm that you basically desire. There isn't really like a bad option. So, you know, there's that. You can even play the Tenyis if you so chose, because like you could still special summon a Shunna, normal summon Adhara, and then go into Chi-Xiao, which could then grab you Longwan, which could grab you another guy, which could grab you the ability to use your Ashana and use your Adhara and stuff like that. So it's not like a terrible option. You can play more of the Yang Zings. You could play, yeah, just a whole bunch of other stuff. So all of that stuff is available to you. You could play Mare Mare as like an additional brick if you wanted to. But yeah, pretty simple. It's Sword Soul. There you go. Don't really have much else to say. There are a few other builds, like I've seen Super Heavy Samurai also kind of works, but for the most part, there's not much to go with Synchro. Another thing I want to mention is like you can play Goaty, which kind of works. There's a few other decks, but yeah, for the most part, it's Sword Soul. Alright, and here we have Xi utilizing Zodiac as the easy deck to play. Now, notably, Zodiac is actually fairly cheap besides Barrage, which Barrage is pretty necessary, to be fair. It allows you access to additional Zodiacs. So there's that. If you want to spend the UR crafting material, you can. If you don't, that's also fine. And the reason for that is because you can also play Zodiacs with things like Kashtira or Eldritch or something along those lines that you might already have in order to just kind of like pair them together and make a similar deck. So you don't technically need the Barrage. But there you go. A super simple deck, super easy to pilot. You just kind of like summon a guy and then make Trident. You can also do the if you have like a Rat Pier, or if you get to discard a guy with Thoroughblade, or if you get to pop a guy with Barrage or something along those lines. If you get a guy into the graveyard, you can basically, if you get specifically Ram into the graveyard, I should say, you can go Chalk-a-9 Reborn the Ram, and then go into Trident, pop your own Ram, bring back the Chalk-a-9, and then go into your Utopic Draco Future, which is a very, very good card that not a lot of decks can deal with, especially if paired with other such, staples and stuff like that. As you can see, we're playing like Solemn Judgments and Solemn Strikes. Those tend to pair the best with the Zodiac stuff, since they're just automatic no's, basically. But all in all, again, it's just kind of staples. It's like however many Zodiacs, which is honestly not a lot. It's like 17 main deck cards or something like that that are basically ways to get to Zodiacs. And then the rest is just stop the opponent, basically. You can play a bit more Zodiacs if you want. You can play a bit less. But it's a fairly simple deck. And while it may look expensive here, again, remember, most of this are either staples that like you may already have access to, or they're cards that like you can just switch out for other cards that you may have, right? If you want to, you can play more trap cards to kind of slow down your opponent. If you want that for going first, you can play more hand traps. You can play, again, as I mentioned, you can play the Kashtira stuff. Some of that is available, so you can, finagle the extra deck and put in like an Arise Heart and a Shangri-Ira or something like that and play more like Kashtira stuff. You can play the Eldritch stuff. That also pairs fairly well, because, again, I'll go over this in a second, but Eldritch is actually entirely playable in all three of the decks. So if you really want to, you can play Eldritch. It's fully playable. Yes, there aren't like floodgates or stuff like that, but again, you can pair them, with the Xyz here with Zodiac. You can pair them with other such random decks if you want to, right? Like for example, all of the zombie stuff is also pretty much available. So you can pair that with any of the fusion, you could play that with any of the Z, any of the synchro, whatever you want to do. Those are all available and main deckable. So there's that. Yeah, but all in all, Zodiac is pretty much the simplest. And let's hop over to the best. And this one should be pretty self-explanatory. It's Pearly. Pearly just got the new pearly Noir, which is very, very strong and pretty useful because it now gives you access to something to utilize the sleeping memory with. But Pearly, it was still pretty good and is still probably the best Xyz deck. The biggest problem with the Xyz just in general, it is pretty weak in comparison to the other two strategies because their top deck, the best deck, and the reason to play the deck just isn't nearly as useful, and especially compared to the loner deck being like Chimera for fusion, the other two don't really have any good loner decks. So you're probably going to have to actually build a deck, or at the very least pseudo build a deck. Now, sadly, Lyralisk got the one card, the one Lyralisk card that actually is useful. It's banned, so you can't OTK with Assembled Nightingale, but you can still play a Lyralisk. But it's significantly weaker because not only is this card very good for OTKs, it's also just very good in general for Lyralisk because it adds protection and adds damage reduction, which matters a lot for such low attack stat monsters. But yeah, it's banned. So while that's banned, Pearly just becomes a lot better. You can play it with myriad of hand traps. You can play the Ghost Trick stuff. If you don't know what that does, you can look that up elsewhere. I'm not going to explain it to you. But you can play it with any other sort of like a discard engine, like the Shaddolls. I'm playing the Dark Worlds because they give me access to additional draws and stuff like that, which is very, very useful. But all in all, the deck is still very good. It's just a little bit more difficult to pilot. If you don't know how to pilot this deck, I would suggest just playing like Zodiac. But if you do already have this deck, if you do already know what this deck is and how it plays, then yeah, this deck is super, super good and super, super fun. It is a little bit inconsistent due to the fact that one Delicious Memory and the two Pearlies, which does hurt the deck, but all in all, it's still pretty consistent. It still does kind of the same things. It can still OTK with Happy. It can still do more or less the same things. The one Delicious kind of matters, but for the most part, like, if you get to Delicious, it doesn't really matter. Like, the difference between having multiple Delicious and just one doesn't really change the math on anything. Besides the, obviously, seeing it. But, like, if you see it, it doesn't really change anything. But yeah, there's the list. Also, not a lot of decks, especially since they don't have, like, Underworld Goddess in the main deck or something like that, since they can't use links. Not a lot of decks have efficient outs to Noir. Like, one question a lot of people will bring up is, like, oh, how does this deck out Noir? And honestly, most decks don't. Like, you can just kind of sit on this. The biggest issue with that is, what do you do to the opponent's deck if they just, like, generate insane advantage? You can't just stare at your opponent, right? But at the very least, with Noir, you can, like, shuffle away some things and hopefully hit important targets because you're unaffected and all of that jazz. So, all in all, fairly decent and definitely the best of the Z strategies available. So, there you go. Yeah, let's hop over to one more thing where I just want to quickly talk about the decks that you can play in any of the three. So, 1 second. Okay, so I mentioned that there are a bunch of decks that you can play with any of the decks or any of the summoning mechanics. But they're not necessarily decks so much as they are engines. Besides, like, Eldritch, you can literally just play, like, a full Eldritch deck. But with that being said, you have the Adventure Engine, which is totally playable, besides Griffin Rider, but you can still substitute that out with a Legal Knight if you wanted to. But this deck is, this engine is, like, fully playable, so you can play that in any of your decks. You have the Kashtira stuff, which Kashtira is technically playable in the Z event, but you also have access to all of the other stuff as well in any of the other strategies, so you can use Birth and stuff like that, which is still there. All of the Snake Eye stuff, surprisingly, is more or less untouched, which pairs very well with Lyrilisc, which is kind of surprising, just because they're a way to get a lot of bodies onto your side of the field, and since Lyrilisc doesn't have to use its normal summon, the normal summon can be used on Snake Eye Ash to get even more rank 1s, so there's that. But this can also be paired with basically anything as well that may want to utilize free bodies onto your field, as well as, like, a searchable interaction, which is kind of cool. Yes, you can't use Flomberg. You can still use the field spell. You can still use Subversion and stuff like that. So Snake Eye is kind of playable and kind of usable. It's less going to be useful in, like, Fusion because of the way that Fusion works, but it's still going to be fairly useful in basically any deck that wants to utilize it. We have Regulus as well. Or more specifically, the Therions. They're basically all entirely playable. And again, with the Spriggans in particular, you can pair them together in Xyz, and all of a sudden you have that entirely playable. And then, of course, we have access to the Eldritch stuff. Oh, and then you also have Super Heavy Samurai. Super Heavy? Yeah. So, notably, in the Synchro deck, Super Heavy Samurai Wakaushi is limited to 1, but in both Fusion and Xyz, it is not. Now, notably, this matters in Xyz because this card can basically get you a free rank 4, and it's incredibly searchable thanks to Motorbike, because what this basically does is in Xyz, you go special summon the Wakaushi, or utilize the effect of Wakaushi in the Pendulum Zone to scale up the Monk to then special summon itself, and then the Monk gets you access to... where is he? This guy. The Soul Gaia. Soul Gaia then equips and special summons itself, and that's a boom, free rank 4. So, very useful. This also doesn't technically take up your normal summon, so you could even utilize your normal summon on something like Wagon, which could then be utilized to go into another thing. So that's another thing you could put in here that kind of can pair with any of them. Now, I say can pair with any of them, but let's be honest, you're not really going to play like Snake Eye in anything other than, or I should say in anything that is fusion related, just because of the way that fusion works. But like, technically speaking, you could play the Kashtira stuff in a fusion deck, right? Like that honestly probably wouldn't be that bad of an idea. Same with the Golden Lord, right? Technically, he does have a fusion. He does exist. The Mad Golden Lord, there, he's right there. But then you also have like the Water Enchantress stuff that you could pair with the fusion. Fusion in particular is kind of weird. With just the way that it works. But like, yeah, all of these are fairly decent engines that you can slap into any of those other archetypes or any of those other strategies that you may want to utilize. And so there's that. Just kind of wanted to give you that heads up as well. But that's going to be it for this episode. Hopefully you guys did indeed enjoy it and gain something from this. And honestly, this new event is pretty interesting. I do enjoy it. I think it's not perfect, but no event is. But it is fairly good, and it's a great concept. I do really enjoy it. It's a very, very fun concept. But again, yeah, it's not perfect. Just, you know, Xyz feels a bit weak, and you can kind of tell. But that's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope that you guys did indeed enjoy it. If you did, I like us very much, so appreciate it. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.